Memorial Day is always the hardest day of the year for any Gold Star family because you relive every moment. And I know on Memorial Day, when I hear taps, when I hear the firing of the guns, I'll be crying. My name is Chuck Stalter, and I'm the brother of Sergeant John Raymond Stalter, who left us on March 3rd, 1967. The funeral procession was almost a mile long, and it was unbelievable in terms of the amount of people who attended the funeral, and it was a very difficult thing. Our family moved to Pico Rivera in August of 1958, and a couple of months after that, my father passed away of a heart attack. So my mother had to raise two young boys that were really kind of wild. And John was a handful, and I always like to say that with John, you had to pay him to be good, and I'm good for nothing. John and I were constantly battling with each other. Mom had to go out and find work. But the one thing that got us through all this were the families in our neighborhood who just brought us in. We became family members to at least 5 different families. John originally was at North Park, and then he left North Park, he went to El Rancho, and he was actively involved in sports, in gymnastics, wrestling, and football. He wasn't large in stature. He's only about 5'7", weighing about 150 pounds, but he is very quick and he is very strong. In wrestling, he even competed in some AAU meets where he also medaled. In football, any of the guys that played with John would tell you he was brutal when he hit them. And he was, like I said, very strong, very quick. In 1965, after graduating, John and his best friend Richard Whiting decided they wanted to join the Army. And they went in on the buddy system. So through their training, they'd be together. They trained basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, advanced infantry training at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and the jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The last time I saw John and Rich together were at a party at our house. It's supposed to be maybe about 10, 20 of John's friends. Turned out to be over 100 people. Just unbelievable in terms of the number of people. One of the last things I remember of the two of them together, they're getting on the roof of our garage and jumping off onto the ground because they wanted to show everyone what they had learned in jump school. The other thing that was amazing about that party, none of the neighbors complained. These guys were their sons. And they brought food over. Our next door neighbor brought over his best tequila and was giving them shots of tequila. It was unbelievable how the neighborhood came together to celebrate their being there, and they're about to leave for Vietnam. On April 19th, 1966, John arrived in Vietnam. And a few months later, he found out that Rich had been killed in action, and totally devastated John. His friends told me he almost went through a mental breakdown regarding that news. But John knew that he had to keep himself together, both for his own safety as well as with the men that he was serving with. As the months went on, John was in the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They were in the thick of all the fighting. Their basic job was search and destroy. Search for the enemy and destroy them. The months would go by. We'd get letters from John. He never told us what he was really going through. We'd get letters saying, oh, today I got chased by a water buffalo. Little anecdotes in regards to what he was doing out there, but never told us how serious and difficult it was out there for him. You can see in his pictures from when he graduated to when he is out there in Vietnam, he lost his youth. He was no longer a young man. And in pictures that I've seen of others who have served in Vietnam, you can see that sudden loss of youth. John continued on. On February 22nd, 1967, a very monumental day for his unit, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. On that day, a combat jump was completed. It was the first combat jump since the Korean War. On that day, John and 779 other paratroopers, or sky soldiers as they call themselves, parachuted into enemy territory. Fortunately, they all landed. No one was wounded, no one was injured, and it was a big story. Life magazine did a cover story on it, and I still have that magazine, and I still have those pictures. Two weeks later, John led a platoon. He had now become a sergeant, and he led his platoon, again, searching for the enemy. On that day, they were going down a path, and they saw a Viet Cong soldier running down the path. They followed that soldier, and as they chased the soldier, unwittingly, they walked into an ambush. As they got into that ambush, John's point man and machine gunner were knocked out immediately. John, again, being the leader of that platoon, tried to run forward to get the machine gun to be able to fire at the enemy. In doing so, he was shot and he was wounded. John went down. But John, again, he had that responsibility for his men. John got back up and went over and got the machine gun. He then was ordering his men to retreat, and John started charging the enemy, taking the enemy fire, allowing his men to retreat. John continued his fire on the enemy until he was mortally wounded. On that day, John and 13 others were killed in action. 5 of his soldiers in his platoon were able to escape and live another day and go back to their families. The one thing that every Gold Star family member remembers is the knock on the door. And that morning, I had just left for school, and my mom and my stepfather were there at the house. My stepfather was a policeman or detective from Mount Hill Police Department, so he's getting dressed to go to work. And my mom heard the knock at the door, and as she opened the door, she saw an Army officer. She knew immediately what he was about to say. And he read from a telegram that said, "Mrs. Stalter, it's with regret that we inform you that your son, John Raymond Stalter, was killed in small arms fire in Vietnam on March 3rd, 1967. Mom froze in her tracks and started crying. My stepfather came up and held her and saw the Army officer. A neighbor had seen him come, so she immediately came to the door and again hugged my mom. And my mom told my stepfather, "You need to go see Chuck get Chuck at school." So I was at school and at El Rancho, and every morning we would have the raising of the flag and the playing of the national anthem. And the ROTC unit at our school would do the flag presentation. So we had just heard the national anthem when I heard my name being called over the intercom to come to the office. So I was walking to the office and I saw my stepfather, and I had noticed he had been crying. And as soon as I came up to him, he told me, "We just found out that your brother was killed in Vietnam." The most difficult part is the wait. It took about another week to week and a half before John would come home. And that's probably one of the most challenging things that a Gold Star family goes through, is the wait for their loved one to come back home. You know, and I talk about the wait of him to come home. When he and his comrades were killed on the 3rd, it took them over 2 to 3 hours for them to be able to get a helicopter in to remove their bodies, as well as those who had lived. They then brought them back to their base camp in Benoit, and they had a ceremony there. They then, he then went to Saigon, where they prepared him. He was then flown to San Francisco, and then met with a military escort, and then by train went from San Francisco to Union Station, and then at Union Station, the funeral home here in Pico Rivera picked them up. Next comes the next big challenge, which is identifying them. So that night we went, it was my mother, father, myself, and 2 of the young ladies that were classmates of John just had heard he was going to be there, just happened to come by. We were the only ones that saw John. And I remembered, you know, a silver casket with the flag on it. And then the mortician opened up the casket for us to identify John. And my mother went up there and immediately said, "That's not my son. That isn't him." And I had to reassure my mother that was John. It looked like he was asleep. He had put some weight on, but he was in a full military uniform. He had some medals on him. He had his new sergeant stripes, but it was John. And it took a little while to convince my mother that that was her son. So then 4 or 5 days later is when we had the funeral. First we had a memorial service at the church at St. Hilary's, and the church is packed. It seems like, you know, half the city must have come for that ceremony. I was overwhelmed. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. And there had been a number of, of our heroes who had lost their lives in Vietnam prior to John. People today still ask me about John. People today still tell me their stories about John and how he touched their lives. And it's just, you know, it's just amazing that, as I said before, a man has not died as long as he is remembered. And John is still alive. And so are 27, because people still talk about them and about how they were impacted by their lives. And this is our history. They are our history, and we cannot let their memories die. They all started on a journey very far away. Little did they know about the land where they would stay. They left as young men with many hopes and desires, leaving from the sunshine, walking into the fire. They have a love for country and those left behind, and even miles away, we were always on their mind. They shared their stories with others and their love of those at home. Yet even surrounded by others, they all still felt alone. It was not their choice to leave this earth, to leave those who they loved, but the choice was made by God to join him up above. For now they are back home, although not with us, but now at peace with the Lord, in a place with no war or fuss. We thank our 27 men for what they sacrificed, and we will always remember them for their love of country, family, and life. Our 27 are sons, brothers, friends, and heroes, today, tomorrow, forevermore.